There is a muscle inside your body that you have never once thought about training. You have probably never heard it mentioned at the gym, never seen it featured in a fitness article, never come across it in a conversation about health or aging or longevity. And yet right now, as you are reading this, that muscle is working. It has been working every single moment of your life since before you were born. It beats approximately 100,000 times per day. It pumps roughly 2,000 gallons of blood through 60,000 miles of vessels without a single conscious instruction from you. And the research being published in the last decade is making something very clear. The biological speed at which you age, how fast your cells deteriorate, how quickly your brain slows down, how early your joints stiffen and your energy collapses, is tied to this muscle in ways that most people have never been told. That muscle is your heart, and this is not going to be the conversation you think it is. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing before we go further, because what we cover in this channel is not surface-level advice. It is the actual mechanism behind why your body does what it does, and once you understand the mechanism, everything else makes sense in a way it never did before. Now, when most people hear the word heart, they hear it through a particular filter. They think about heart attacks, about cholesterol, about cardio workouts, about the basics their doctor checks at an annual physical, and all of that matters. But the conversation that is not happening, the one that the most current research is pushing to the front, is about something called cardiac age versus chronological age. Your chronological age is the number on your driver's license. Your cardiac age is the biological age of your cardiovascular system, measured by how efficiently your heart pumps blood, how elastic your arteries are, how well your autonomic nervous system regulates your heart rate under stress, and how quickly your heart recovers after exertion. And for most Americans, those two numbers are not the same. A 2015 analysis published in the journal Preventing Chronic Disease, using data from over 500,000 adults collected by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, found that approximately 70% of American adults had a cardiac age that was older than their actual age. Not by a small margin. The average gap was 7 years older. Some groups showed gaps of 15 years or more. That means the average American adult is walking around with a cardiovascular system that is aging roughly 7 years ahead of the rest of their body. And because the cardiovascular system is the delivery infrastructure for every other organ, when your heart ages fast, everything else follows. Let me explain why this matters in a way that goes deeper than the usual statistics. Every single cell in your body, every neuron in your brain, every fiber of your muscle tissue, every cell in your skin that determines how you look, depends on a continuous delivery of oxygen and glucose through the blood. Your heart is the engine of that delivery. When the engine runs well, nutrient delivery is efficient, waste products are cleared quickly, inflammation is kept in check, and cellular repair happens at the rate it is supposed to happen. When the engine ages ahead of schedule, delivery becomes sluggish. Oxygen supply to the brain decreases, which affects cognitive sharpness, memory consolidation, and processing speed. Waste products accumulate in tissues longer than they should, which promotes a state of low-grade chronic inflammation, and chronic inflammation is one of the most well-documented accelerants of cellular aging. Researchers have given this process a name. They call it inflammaging, a portmanteau of inflammation and aging, and it is now considered one of the central mechanisms through which biological age diverges from chronological age. The scientist most associated with the modern understanding of cardiac aging is Dr. Douglas Seals, a professor and researcher at the University of Colorado Boulder, who has spent decades studying what happens to the human cardiovascular system across the lifespan. His laboratory has documented a phenomenon called arterial stiffening with exceptional precision. Arteries are not rigid pipes. In a young, healthy cardiovascular system, arteries are elastic. They expand when the heart pushes blood through them and recoil between beats, which helps propel blood forward and protects downstream vessels from the full force of each heartbeat. As we age, the structural proteins in arterial walls, primarily elastin and collagen, change in composition. Elastin breaks down and is not replaced at the same rate. Collagen crosslinks in ways that make the tissue stiffer and less yielding. The result is that with each passing decade, your arteries lose some of their ability to flex and recoil, which forces your heart to work harder to push blood through, and which exposes the smaller, more fragile vessels of the brain and kidneys, to higher pressure pulses that they are not designed to handle. Dr. Seals and his colleagues have demonstrated that this stiffening process is not a fixed biological destiny. It is modifiable. The rate at which it progresses is directly influenced by lifestyle factors that most people either underestimate or address in the wrong way. Here is where I want to spend real time, because I think this is the part that changes how you see the problem. Most people, when they think about heart health, think about exercise in a very blunt way. Do cardio, run, ride a bike. That understanding is correct but incomplete, in the same way that saying eat less sugar is technically correct, but leaves out almost everything you need to actually change your behavior. The specific type of cardiovascular training that most powerfully reverses arterial stiffening and improves what researchers call heart rate variability is a form of training that very few people do consistently, and heart rate variability, which we are about to get into, may be the single most important number you have never measured. Heart rate variability, abbreviated as HRV, is not the speed at which your heart beats. It is the variation in the time interval between consecutive heartbeats. If your heart beats 60 times per minute, the naive assumption is that each beat happens exactly 1 second apart. In reality, in a healthy cardiovascular system, there is measurable and meaningful variation between those intervals. One beat might come 780 milliseconds after the last. The next might come 840 milliseconds later. The one after that, 810. That subtle, irregular rhythm is not a malfunction. It is a sign of a highly adaptive, well-regulated autonomic nervous system. Low HRV, where beats come in a more rigidly uniform pattern, is associated with reduced cardiovascular flexibility, higher levels of systemic inflammation, poorer stress recovery, and a significantly elevated risk of cardiac events. A landmark study published in the journal Circulation in 2001, drawing on the Framingham Heart Study cohort, showed that low HRV was an independent predictor of all-cause mortality, separate from and additive to other conventional risk factors like blood pressure and cholesterol. And critically, HRV declines with age, but the rate of that decline varies enormously based on factors that are within your control. The mechanism behind why HRV declines matters here. Your heart rate is regulated by two branches of your autonomic nervous system: the sympathetic branch, which accelerates the heart in response to stress or demand, and the parasympathetic branch, which slows and steadies it during recovery and rest. HRV is essentially a measurement of how dynamically those two systems are communicating and balancing each other. High HRV means the parasympathetic system is robust and responsive, capable of quickly counterbalancing sympathetic activation. Low HRV means the parasympathetic system has weakened, and the sympathetic system is running with less opposition. Chronic sympathetic dominance, what researchers also call autonomic imbalance, is directly linked to accelerated vascular aging. Your arteries stiffen faster, your inflammatory markers rise, your cellular repair mechanisms become less efficient, and your brain begins to show the downstream effects of reduced perfusion. This is not a metaphor. This is a measurable cascade that researchers can track from a simple HRV measurement taken over 5 minutes. Now here is something worth pausing on before we continue, because I think it changes how you read everything that follows. If this conversation is landing differently than you expected, if you are realizing there are mechanisms in your own body that you have been unaware of, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Sharing this video with someone who needs to hear it is one of the most useful things you can do today, not for an algorithm, but because most people do not know any of this. And the gap between what the research shows and what the average person understands about their own body is genuinely enormous. Let me now bring in the specific biological lever that ties HRV, arterial stiffening, and biological aging together in a way that makes the solution obvious. That lever is vagal tone. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in your body. It runs from your brainstem all the way down through your neck, your chest, and into your abdomen, innervating your heart, your lungs, your liver, your stomach, and your intestines. The vagus nerve is the primary highway of the parasympathetic nervous system, and its influence on your heart is direct and powerful. When vagal tone is high, meaning when the vagus nerve is sending strong, consistent signals to the heart rate variability is high, arterial stiffness progresses more slowly, inflammatory cytokines are suppressed, and the cellular aging process runs at its designed pace. When vagal tone is chronically low, The opposite happens across every one of those dimensions simultaneously. Dr. Stephen Porges, a neuroscientist whose work at the Kinsey Institute and the University of North Carolina has focused extensively on the vagus nerve, has documented through what he calls polyvagal theory that vagal tone is not fixed. It is a dynamic, trainable physiological capacity that responds to specific inputs in predictable ways. The inputs that most reliably build vagal tone are not what most people expect, and understanding them is the practical heart of this entire conversation. The first and most research-supported input for improving vagal tone and HRV is a specific pattern of breathing called resonance frequency breathing, or coherence breathing. In 2015, a meta-analysis published in the journal Psychological Medicine, drawing on 22 randomized controlled trials, found that slow-paced breathing at approximately 5 to 6 breath cycles per minute produced consistent, measurable improvements in HRV across a wide range of populations, including people with cardiovascular disease, anxiety disorders, and healthy adults. 5 to 6 breaths per minute works out to roughly a 5-second inhale, followed by a 5-second exhale, repeated for 10 to 20 minutes. This rate of breathing appears to synchronize the oscillations of your heart rate, blood pressure regulation, and respiratory rhythm into a state of physiological coherence that directly stimulates the vagus nerve and strengthens its parasympathetic influence on the heart. The effect is not merely relaxation. It is a measurable, quantifiable change in autonomic balance that has been shown to persist beyond the practice session itself with regular repetition. Researchers at the HeartMath Institute, including Dr. Roland McCready, have published extensively on the physiological specificity of this effect, showing through controlled studies that consistent coherence breathing practice over periods of 4 to 12 weeks produces statistically significant improvements in HRV, reductions in salivary cortisol, and decreases in inflammatory markers including C-reactive protein. The second input is exercise, but with a precision most people miss. The type of cardiovascular training most powerfully linked to improvements in HRV and reductions in arterial stiffness is not steady-state moderate-intensity exercise done indefinitely at the same pace. It is a combination of two training patterns: low-intensity, long-duration aerobic work done at a heart rate, where you can hold a full conversation, and short intervals of genuinely high-intensity effort, followed by full recovery. This combination appears in the research under a framework called polarized training, popularized in the sports science literature by Dr. Stephen Seiler of the University of Agder in Norway, whose analysis of elite endurance athletes found that the most effective training distributions kept roughly 80% of training volume at low intensity and 20% at high intensity, with very little time spent in the moderate middle zone. The physiological reason this distribution matters for aging is specific. The low-intensity work, done at an easy aerobic pace for 30 to 60 minutes most days, directly builds the density and efficiency of mitochondria in cardiac muscle cells, improves vascular compliance, and trains the parasympathetic system to recover the heart quickly after mild exertion. The high-intensity intervals, which might be as brief as 6 to 8 bouts of 30 seconds of near maximal effort with 90 seconds of full recovery between them, trigger what is called VO2 max adaptation, an increase in the heart's stroke volume and the muscle's ability to extract oxygen from blood. VO2 max, your maximal oxygen uptake capacity, is one of the strongest known predictors of longevity across all-cause mortality studies. A 2018 study published in JAMA Network Open, following over 100,000 patients at the Cleveland Clinic over a median follow-up period of more than 8 years, found that low cardiorespiratory fitness was associated with a higher risk of mortality than smoking, diabetes, or hypertension, each of which are conditions we treat as major health priorities. Low fitness was the strongest predictor in the analysis. The third input, and the one that surprises most people most reliably, is cold exposure followed by warmth. Dr. Seals and his collaborators have published research showing that controlled cold water immersion of the face and upper chest, even brief exposures of 30 to 60 seconds in cold water between 60 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit, activates the diving reflex, a primitive autonomic response that immediately and dramatically increases vagal activity and drops heart rate. Regular exposure to cold in controlled conditions has been shown to increase baseline vagal tone over time through a process of autonomic recalibration. The cold stimulus is a stress that the parasympathetic system must counteract, And like any system that is repeatedly challenged in a controlled way, it adapts by becoming stronger and more responsive. The transition to warmth after cold further reinforces this recalibration by triggering vasodilation and a parasympathetic rebound that is measurably larger than baseline. This is not a fringe wellness trend. The physiological mechanisms have been well characterized in peer-reviewed literature, and the dose required is modest. A cold shower of 30 to 60 seconds, 3 to 5 times per week, is sufficient to begin producing measurable autonomic adaptation in most healthy adults. The fourth input is sleep, specifically the architecture of sleep, rather than just its duration. During slow-wave sleep, the deepest stages of non-REM sleep, your body enters the most thorough parasympathetic dominance of any 24-hour period. Your heart rate slows dramatically, HRV reaches its daily peak, arterial pressure drops in what researchers call nocturnal dipping, and growth hormone is released in its largest daily pulse, driving cellular repair and vascular maintenance. A 2017 study published in the European Heart Journal, following over 3,000 adults over 5 years, found that poor sleep quality, defined by reduced slow-wave sleep duration and increased nighttime sympathetic activity, was independently associated with a 63% higher risk of cardiovascular events. Disrupted sleep is not just tiredness the next day. It is a direct suppressor of the parasympathetic restorative processes that counteract cardiac aging. The most impactful single change for improving slow-wave sleep quality that appears consistently in the sleep research is maintaining a consistent sleep and wake time 7 days a week, because the circadian regulation of sleep architecture is exquisitely sensitive to schedule consistency in a way that most people deeply underestimate. The fifth input involves the gut, and this is a connection that most people have never heard articulated, because the science connecting the gut microbiome to cardiovascular aging is recent enough that it has not yet filtered into mainstream health conversation. The vagus nerve does not only run from the brain to the gut. Approximately 80% of the signaling traffic on the vagus nerve travels from the gut to the brain, not the other way around. The microbiome, the trillions of microbial organisms living in your large intestine, directly communicates with the vagus nerve through multiple mechanisms, including the production of short-chain fatty acids, the synthesis of neurotransmitters, including serotonin and GABA, and the activation of enteroendocrine cells that send vagal afferent signals toward the brainstem. A 2021 study published in Nature Communications, led by researchers at the University of Nottingham, found that specific gut microbial profiles were significantly associated with higher HRV across a cohort of over 500 adults. The bacteria most strongly correlated with high HRV were those associated with fiber fermentation and butyrate production, specifically Ruminococcaceae and Lactospiraceae families. This means that what you eat affects not just your digestive health, but the functional strength of your vagal tone, and therefore the rate at which your heart and arteries age. Diets low in fermentable fiber and high in ultra-processed foods are not just metabolically damaging, they are measurably associated with lower vagal tone and accelerated cardiac aging through a mechanism most people have never been told exists. Now I want to put this all together as a complete picture, because I think the pattern that emerges is more coherent and more actionable than any individual recommendation. Your heart is a muscle that controls the speed of your biological aging through its influence on oxygen delivery, inflammation regulation, and autonomic balance. The key metric is not your resting heart rate in isolation or your blood pressure alone. It is heart rate variability, which reflects the functional strength of your parasympathetic nervous system and your vagal tone. Vagal tone is trainable. It responds to specific, consistent inputs, slow and paced breathing at resonance frequency, a polarized exercise pattern that includes both easy aerobic work and brief high-intensity intervals, controlled cold exposure that trains autonomic recalibration, consistent sleep architecture that allows full slow-wave restoration, and a diet rich enough in fermentable fiber to sustain the gut microbial populations that feed the vagal signaling pathway. None of these require expensive equipment. None require a gym membership or a personal trainer. The breathing practice requires nothing except 10 minutes and your own lungs. The cold exposure can be accomplished in any shower. The exercise pattern can be structured around walking, cycling, or any accessible activity. The dietary change is additive rather than restrictive. It is about what you add to your diet, rather than what you eliminate. What makes this conversation different from the typical health content you encounter is not the complexity of the information, but the specificity of the mechanism. When you know that your heart's aging speed is controlled by the balance between your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and that your parasympathetic system is trainable through specific and well-characterized inputs, you are no longer in the position of following rules you do not understand. You are making decisions based on biological reality. And that kind of knowledge is different. It does not fade after a week or get replaced by the next trend. It becomes part of how you see your body. The mechanism does not change, only the evidence around it accumulates. There is one more thing worth saying here, because I think it is the piece that ties this entire conversation to something larger. The rate at which you age is not written in your genetics alone. Twin studies, including a landmark analysis of over 400,000 twins conducted across multiple Scandinavian registries, have estimated that lifestyle and environmental factors account for between 70 and 80% of the variance in cardiovascular aging, with genetic factors accounting for only 20 to 30%. You have far more influence over your biological clock than the cultural narrative around aging has ever suggested. Most people move through their 30s, 40s, and 50s with the implicit assumption that decline is happening to them, that it is inevitable, that the only honest response is to slow it down at the margins. The research does not support that assumption. The research supports something much more interesting, that the systems responsible for your biological aging are responsive, adaptive, and accessible, and that most people have simply never been shown where the levers are. If this conversation has shifted something for you, even a single assumption about your own biology, that is exactly the kind of shift that tends to compound over time. The best thing you can do right now is save this video to come back to it. Share it with someone who has been telling you they feel older than they should. And if you want to go deeper on the specific science of how your autonomic nervous system shapes every aspect of your health, subscribe to Smart Psychology, because this is exactly the kind of conversation we have here, every single week, built on the mechanism, not the myth. Your heart has been working every second of your life without a single request for help. It is worth understanding how to work with it.